The sound was not the man's dying, but the world's deference. It came as a pressure wave first, a shift in the air, the sudden vacuum of held breaths, then the scrape of a bar lifting, the groan of iron-bound oak, and the percussive shock of 100 boots striking stone in unison. Every soul in the room dropped to their knees. She kept her hands where they were. The needle, a sliver of polished bone, slid through the torn flesh of the soldier on the pallet. Her fingers, stained with blood and herbal paste, worked with a detached economy of motion. She did not look up. She did not need to. The silence that had fallen was a specific kind of silence, heavy with the weight of a singular authority. It was the quiet that followed a lightning strike, when the world waited to see what had been felled. Her focus narrowed to the thread, a gut string she had boiled herself for strength and cleanliness, and the precise tension required to close the ragged edges of the wound. The soldier, Yorick, was a beta, strong of build but fading fast, his breathing a wet, shallow rasp. The gash in his side was deep, a spear thrust that had gone septic. The air smelled of fever, iron, and the sharp tang of the yarrow she had packed into the injury to staunch the bleeding. Behind her, the silence stretched, growing thinner, more dangerous. She could feel the king's presence as a physical weight at her back, a concentration of power and impatience. His stillness was not patient. It was the stillness of a predator that has cornered its prey and is deciding, with cold amusement, how the end will come. Still, she did not turn. The man on the pallet mattered. The king, in this singular, sacred moment of mending, did not. She knotted the final stitch, her movements fluid and unbroken. Then, and only then, did she reach for a clean strip of linen, dip it in a bowl of cooled, boiled water, and begin to wipe the excess blood from Yorick's skin. Her hands were steady. The tremor she had expected to find was absent, burned away by the cold fire of her concentration. She laid a poultice of moss and crushed willow bark over the suture line, the familiar, earthy scent a small anchor in the suffocating tension of the room. She bound it tightly, her knuckles brushing the fever-hot skin, the soft whisper of linen being tied. Only when the dressing was secure, when Yorick's breathing had eased into something closer to true sleep, did she rise. She did not turn immediately. She went to the basin of water on the nearby stand, the one meant for the patient, and washed her hands. The water turned a murky pink. She dried them on a rough-spun towel, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Finally, she faced him. King Cassian of the Wastes stood just inside the doorway of the makeshift infirmary, flanked by two of his personal guard, their faces impassive stone. But it was the king who held the room captive. He was not a large man, not in the way of legends. His power was not in his size, but in his density, as if all the air around him had been compressed into a solid, unreadable core. His hair was the color of wet slate, his eyes a pale, chilling gray. They were fixed on her, and in their depths was nothing she could name. Not anger, not curiosity, just an unnerving, absolute focus. The rest of the room, medics, orderlies, wounded men propped on their elbows, remained prostrate, their faces pressed to the cold floor. "You have the king's attention," he said. His voice was low, devoid of inflection, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep river. It was not a compliment. Alara met his gaze. She felt the old, familiar instinct to make herself smaller, to placate, to apologize. It rose in her throat like bile, and she swallowed it down. That person was dead, buried in another life. The man was dying, she said. Her own voice was rough from disuse but steady. Your Majesty was not. A flicker of something, not surprise, but perhaps a recalibration of his assessment, passed through his eyes. It was there and gone in an instant. He took a step into the room, his boots making no sound on the stone. The guards remained at the door. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze dropping to the sleeping soldier, then back to her. He looked at her hands, still damp, the nails rimmed with dried blood. I am told you are a traveler, he said. It was not a question. I go where I am needed. And you are needed here? The war you are fighting provides ample need. The words were sharper than she intended, but she did not take them back. To show weakness now, after such a flagrant display of defiance, would be a fatal error. He had waited. That was the most unsettling part. A king of his reputation, a man forged in the brutal politics of the borderlands, did not wait. He acted, he punished. His inaction was a question she could not answer, and it frightened her more than any threat. He circled the pallet, his eyes scanning the neat line of her stitches, the clean dressing. He was assessing her work as a craftsman might assess the work of an apprentice. They call you the bone setter, he said, his back now to her, a crude name for a delicate skill. The world is crude, she replied. I adapt. He turned back to her, and for the first time, a shadow of something other than command touched his features. It looked like weariness, a profound, soul-deep exhaustion that his rigid posture could not entirely conceal. You will remain at the keep, he stated. My men have a habit of getting injured. Your adaptation will be of use. It was not a request. It was an annexation. She had been claimed, a resource to be utilized. The freedom she had guarded so jealously for years had just evaporated in the cold, still air of a king's whim. She wanted to refuse, to tell him she served no master, but the words died on her tongue. The look in his eyes was not that of a tyrant seeking a servant. It was the look of a man drowning in solitude, who had just found a solid object to cling to in the dark. And that, she knew instinctively, was infinitely more dangerous. As you command, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He gave a single sharp nod, the barest acknowledgement of her submission. Then he turned and swept from the room, his guards falling into step behind him. The heavy sound of the oak door closing, the bar scraping back into place. The moment the door was sealed, the room exhaled. People scrambled to their feet, their movements jerky, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. They stared at her, this quiet, unassuming woman who had ignored a king and lived. Alara looked down at her hands. They were trembling now, the reaction she had suppressed finally breaking through. She had survived the confrontation, but she had a sickening feeling that she had just lost something far more important than her life. She had been seen. The chamber they gave her was high in the eastern spire, overlooking the blighted plains that gave the wastes their name. It was not a cell. There was no lock on the outside of the door, only a heavy bolt on the inside. The single window was a narrow slit, barred against attack from without, but it let in the thin gray light of morning. It was a room for a person of some status, a tactician, a valued emissary, or a captive with a rare skill. She spent the first week in a state of watchful stillness, learning the rhythms of the fortress. It was a place stripped of all excess. Every action had a purpose. The guards changed with silent precision. The cooks served rations that were nourishing but joyless. The clang of the training yard began at dawn and ended at dusk. It was a machine of war, and at its heart was the cold, silent engine of King Koshian. She saw him rarely, and always from a distance. A glimpse of him crossing the bailey, his dark cloak a stark slash against the gray stone. A view from her window of him training alone in the pre-dawn mist. The movements of his sword so economical and precise, they seemed less like practice and more like a deadly meditation. He never looked toward her window. She was certain he knew she was there. Her days fell into a routine. She was given charge of the infirmary, a long, drafty hall that always smelled of damp stone and misery. The castle's chirurgeon was an old man with shaking hands who was relieved to cede his duties. Alara worked from sunrise until long after the evening meal, stitching wounds, setting bones, and brewing tinctures from the meager supply of herbs she demanded from the quartermaster. The soldiers, at first, were wary of her. They had all heard the story of her first encounter with the king. They treated her with a skittish deference, as if she were some unpredictable force of nature. But her hands were gentle, and her work was good. Men who had been destined for the burial pit were walking again within a fortnight. Slowly, the fear was replaced by a quiet, gruff respect. They never spoke of the king, but she learned about him through the shape of their wounds. She saw the cost of his campaigns, the price of his undisputed authority. She saw the clean, brutal efficiency of the enemy's tactics and the grim determination of his soldiers to meet it. One evening, a young guard, no older than 17, was brought to her with a crossbow bolt in his shoulder. As she worked to extract it, his face pale with pain, he spoke in a low whisper. He was there, the king, on the wall. We were outnumbered. They were coming over the parapet. He didn't even shout, just moved. And where he moved, they fell. The boy's eyes were wide with a kind of religious awe. Alara kept her own eyes on her work. "He is your king," she said, her voice neutral. "And you are his soldier." "No," the boy insisted, grabbing her wrist with his good hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "You don't understand. It's not about duty. It's that he is empty, like the winter sky. There's nothing in him to be afraid, so the fear can't touch him. It touches us instead." He released her, slumping back against the pallet, his breathing ragged. Alara finished binding the wound in silence, but the boy's words echoed in her mind. Empty, like the winter sky. It was a terrifyingly accurate description of the man she had seen. A man who felt nothing could not be reasoned with, could not be swayed by pity or fear. He could only be obeyed or destroyed. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind howled around the spire, a lonely, mournful sound. She stood at her window, looking out at the featureless dark. She had spent 5 years running, 5 years making herself small and forgettable, a ghost drifting through the back roads of the world. She had healed peasants and merchants, never staying in one place long enough to be known. She had cultivated anonymity as a shield. Here, in this place of stone and silence, she was more visible than she had ever been. She was the woman who had defied the king, the woman he had kept. She was an anomaly, and anomalies drew attention. And attention was the one thing she could not afford. The door to her chamber opened. The faint click of a latch, then the slow creak of old wood. She did not startle. She had heard the single set of footsteps approaching down the corridor, their tread too light for a guard, too deliberate for a servant. She turned slowly from the window. King Koshian stood in the doorway. He was not dressed in the severe black armor he wore in the yard. but in a simple tunic of dark wool. He held no weapon. He looked for a moment like an ordinary man. Then he met her eyes, and the illusion shattered. The emptiness the young soldier had spoken of was there, a vast, cold expanse. "You do not sleep," he said. It was not a question. "The wind is loud." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut was deafening in the small room. He did not move closer, but his presence seemed to suck the air from the space, making it feel impossibly small. He was looking around the room, at the pallet she slept on, at the small table where she ground her herbs, at the single candle guttering in its dish. "This is sufficient for you? I require very little." His gaze came to rest on her. "I have found that the people who require the least are often the most difficult to control. I have no desire to be controlled, Your Majesty, only to be left to my work." "Your work is now my work," he stated, his voice flat. "Your skill belongs to this keep, to me." The possessiveness in his tone was chilling. It was the way a man might speak of a prized sword or a well-trained hound. She felt a surge of the old, defiant anger. "My skill is my own. It is loaned, not owned." For a long moment, he was silent. He simply watched her, his gray eyes unblinking. She felt like a specimen under glass, every flaw, every secret laid bare for his inspection. She forced herself to hold his gaze, to not look away. It was a battle of wills fought in absolute silence. "Yorick lives," he said finally, changing the subject so abruptly it was disorienting. "The soldier you saved. He walks the battlements again. I am glad to hear it. He was my second. A good man. I had already consigned him to the pyre." He said it without emotion, a simple statement of fact. But beneath the surface, she sensed something else, a crack in the frozen facade. He was telling her something, but she did not know what. He was offering a piece of information, and with a man like Cassian, information was a currency more valuable than gold. "You are a better healer than the last 3 I have executed," he said. The words hung in the air between them, cold and sharp as shards of ice. It was both a compliment and a threat, a reminder of her value and of its precariousness. He wanted her to understand her position. She was useful, therefore she was alive. The moment she ceased to be useful, she would cease to be. "Then you are fortunate I was passing through," she replied, her voice carefully devoid of fear. His mouth quirked, a bare, fleeting movement of muscle that was not quite a smile. It was the most expression she had ever seen on his face, and it was deeply unsettling. "There is no such thing as fortune," he said, "only choices and their consequences." He turned then, his movements as economical as ever. He opened the door and was gone, leaving only the scent of cold night air and the lingering weight of his presence. Alara stood frozen for a long time after he left, her heart hammering against her ribs. She went to the door and slid the heavy bolt into place. The solid, final thud of wood and iron. It was a futile gesture, and she knew it. The bolt would not keep him out if he chose to enter. It was a lock against the world, not against the king. She had not been dismissed. She had been warned. And in that warning, she had heard something else, something she was terrified to name. The first faint echo of a man who had been alone for too long, speaking into the dark and waiting, for the first time, for an answer. The subtle poison in the keep began with a tremor. A guard on watch, a man known for a steady hand with a bow, found his fingers shaking so badly he could not nock an arrow. He was sent to Alara, complaining of a deep chill in his bones that no fire could warm. She gave him a tonic for fever and sent him to his bunk, thinking it a simple egg. A week later, he was dead. Two more followed within the fortnight. Both were strong men in their prime, veterans of a dozen campaigns. Both presented with the same symptoms: the uncontrollable tremors, the profound chill, the creeping paralysis that started in the extremities and worked its way inward until the heart and lungs simply gave up. There were no marks on their bodies, no signs of infection. Alara performed an examination on the third man just after he died, her hands moving over the cold flesh in the quiet of the infirmary's morgue. She found nothing. No poison she could name left so little a trace. Yet she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the dead man's skin that this was no sickness. This was a weapon. Her suspicions fell, almost immediately, on one man. Lord Valerius, the king's advisor, was a constant, silken presence at court. He was a man of impeccable manners and quiet influence, his face a handsome, smiling mask that never quite reached his eyes. He had sought her out shortly after her arrival, his conversation a pleasant, probing dance designed to unearth her history. She had given him nothing, and he had glided away, his smile undiminished. But she had felt his gaze on her since, assessing, calculating. Valerius was the only one who seemed truly at ease in the king's oppressive orbit. He was the whisper in the king's ear, the hand that managed the kingdom's alliances and intrigues, while Cation managed its wars. He was everything Cation was not: smooth where the king was rough, articulate where the king was silent, warm where the king was glacial. And Alara trusted him less than any man she had ever met. She began to watch him. She noticed the way he spoke to the quartermaster, the quiet word with the captain of the city watch. He was a spider, and the keep was his web. And now, his web was killing the king's most loyal soldiers. She needed proof, but she had no way to get it. She was a healer, confined to the infirmary. She had no access to the court's inner workings, no allies to confide in. To voice her suspicions without evidence would be suicide. The king did not suffer fools, and Valerius had his ear. One night, another man was brought in, his body already racked with the telltale tremors. It was Jorik, the man she had saved on her first day. His eyes, when they found hers, were filled with a desperate, pleading terror. "It's the cold," he rasped, his teeth chattering. "It's inside me. I can't get warm." Ilara worked frantically, trying every remedy she knew. She built the fire in the infirmary until the room was stifling. She wrapped him in heated blankets. She forced hot broth and fever-reducing teas down his throat. Nothing worked. The chill was radiating from within him, a fire consuming its fuel in reverse. As she was changing his sweat-soaked tunic, she saw it, a small dark stain on the inside of the collar near the seam. It was almost invisible against the rough brown fabric. She brought it to her nose. It had a faint, cloying, sweet smell, like almonds left to rot. She had smelled it once before, years ago, in a port city in the south. A courtesan had used it to dispose of a wealthy patron who had grown tiresome. Nightshade extract, refined and concentrated, administered in small, steady doses, it would produce exactly these symptoms. It was a poison of whispers, not shouts, a coward's weapon. Her blood ran cold. It would have been added to the laundry, a few drops on the collars of the king's most trusted men. A slow, methodical culling of his power base. It was brilliant, it was untraceable, and it was Valerius's style. She knew she had to go to the king. It was a terrifying prospect. She had no proof, only a stain on a collar and a half-remembered scent. But Yorick was dying, and she had saved him once. She would not fail him now. She left him in the care of the old chirurgeon and walked out of the infirmary, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The corridors of the keep were dark and silent. The guards at their posts watched her pass, their faces impassive, but she felt their eyes follow her. She did not know the way to the king's private chambers, but she walked as if she did, her stride purposeful. She followed the path of greatest authority, climbing stairs that grew less worn, passing tapestries that were less faded. Finally, she found herself in a hallway guarded by two of the king's elite guard, the silent sentinels who had been with him on that first day. They blocked her path, their spears crossed. "The king is not to be disturbed," one of them said, his voice a low rumble. "He will see me," Alara said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Tell him it concerns the health of his men. Tell him it concerns Yorick." The guard hesitated. He looked at his companion, then back at her. Her reputation in the keep, it seemed, carried some weight after all. He gave a curt nod and disappeared through the heavy oak door behind him. Alara waited, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The silence stretched. She imagined the conversation inside, the guard's report, the king's dismissal. She braced herself for refusal. The door opened. The guard stepped out. "The king will see you." She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. Cassian's study was as stark as the rest of the castle, but it was filled with maps. They were pinned to the walls, spread across a massive table, weighted down with stones and daggers. It was the room of a man who saw the world as a series of strategic problems to be solved. He was standing by the fire, one hand resting on the mantle. He had not turned to face her. "The guard said Yorick is unwell," he said, his voice quiet. "He is dying," she replied, the words blunt and hard, as the others did. "It is not a sickness. It is a poison." He turned then, slowly. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, making his expression impossible to read. But his eyes were sharp, focused. "Show me." She approached the table, her hands trembling as she pulled the small piece of fabric she had cut from Yorick's collar from her sleeve. She laid it on a map of the Northern Territories. On the inside of the collar, she explained, her voice low and urgent, "A stain. It smells of bitter almonds, nightshade, a slow poison administered over weeks. It mimics a wasting sickness. It leaves no trace in the blood after death." He bent over the table, his head close to hers. She could feel the heat from his body, smell the faint scent of leather and cold steel that clung to him. He picked up the piece of fabric and brought it to his nose. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. "Valerius," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of grim certainty. "He oversees the castle's domestic operations. The laundry would be under his purview." "He is removing your loyalists," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper, "one by one, where no one can see." Cassian placed the fabric back on the map with deliberate care. He straightened up, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. The emptiness was still there, but now it was not vacant. It was the emptiness of a storm gathering its strength, a terrifying, potent void. "You have brought me a dangerous truth, healer. Truth is always dangerous. And what do you expect me to do with it? Arrest my most trusted advisor on the word of an itinerant bone setter with a mysterious past?" The words were a test, sharp and cruel. He was pushing her, wanting to see if she would break. "I expect you to save your men," she shot back, her fear eclipsed by a sudden hot flare of anger. "I expect you to be the king they believe you are." The silence that followed was absolute. He stared at her, and she felt stripped bare, as if he could see every secret she had ever kept, every fear she had ever harbored. She saw the wound she carried, the reason she had run for all those years, reflected in his cold, gray eyes. He had known all along. He had known who she was. "You are a fool to have come to me," he said, his voice so soft it was almost a caress. "You should have run." "I am done running," she said, and the truth of the words settled in her bones, solid and real. For the first time in 5 years, it was true. He took a step closer, erasing the small space between them. He reached out, not to strike her, not to seize her, but to gently touch a lock of hair that had fallen across her face. His fingers were calloused and cold, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. It was the most vulnerable gesture she had ever witnessed from him, and it terrified her more than any display of his power. "Then you will stand with me when the storm breaks," he said. It was not a question. It was a pronouncement of fate. And in that moment, standing in the heart of the fortress, with a dying man in her infirmary and a king's cold fury before her, Ilara knew she was no longer just a healer. She was a conspirator, and her life, which she had so carefully guarded, was no longer her own. The trap, when it was sprung, was not for Cation. It was for her. They had been working in secret for a week, a silent, unwilling partnership forged in the firelight of his study. He moved with chilling speed and precision. Under the guise of a strategic review, he replaced the guards in the kitchens and the laundry with men from his personal retinue, men whose loyalty was absolute. He began taking his meals alone, prepared by a cook he had known since childhood. He was isolating himself, making himself a smaller target, while Ilara worked to find an antidote. She spent every waking hour with Yurich, who clung to life by a thread, and with her books and herbs. The poison was insidious, binding itself to the nerves, slowly freezing the body's functions. A cure would be difficult, a counteragent complex to brew. She felt she was close, but time was running out. Valerius must have sensed the shift, the subtle tightening of the king's inner circle, the new faces in the service corridors. He was too clever not to notice the web contracting around him. And so he struck first, not at the king, but at the source of the king's new information. It happened at dawn. Ilara was in the infirmary tending to Yorick when the doors burst open. It was not the king's guard. It was the city watch, their livery a stark contrast to the keep's sober blacks. And at their head was Lord Valerius, his face a perfect mask of regretful duty. "Ilara of Oakhaven," he announced, his voice ringing with false piety. "By order of the King's Council, you are under arrest for treason, for the deliberate and malicious poisoning of the men of this keep." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The old chirurgeon gasped. The few conscious patients stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. Valerius's men moved forward, their hands reaching for her. She did not resist. She stood perfectly still as they bound her wrists in front of her with rough rope. Her mind was racing, trying to understand. The king's counsel, not the king himself. Valerius had outmaneuvered him. He had gone to the council, a body of aging lords and bureaucrats whom Cation largely ignored, and presented his case. And he had used her past against her. Oakhaven, the name she had not heard spoken in 5 years. the home she had fled in disgrace. Valerius smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of his lips. "We found your stores, healer. A remarkable quantity of nightshade, enough to kill every man in this fortress twice over." He had planted it. Of course he had. He would have known where she kept her supplies. He had turned her own work, her own knowledge, into the weapon that would condemn her. They dragged her from the infirmary. As they passed Jorik's cot, his eyes fluttered open. He tried to speak, but only a faint groan escaped his lips. He knew. He knew she was trying to save him. They took her not to the dungeons, but to the council chamber. It was a grand, cold room, dominated by a heavy stone table. The council members were already assembled, a collection of grim-faced old men who smelled of dust and fear. They looked at her as if she were a serpent that had slithered into their midst. Valerius made his case with practiced ease. He spoke of the mysterious traveler who had appeared from nowhere, who had so quickly gained a position of trust. He spoke of the sickness that had begun only after her arrival. He produced vials of the poison he had discovered among her things. He even produced a witness, a trembling kitchen maid who swore under oath that she had seen the healer lingering near the laundry late at night. It was a masterful performance, a tapestry woven from half-truths and outright lies, but it was seamless. They did not ask her to speak. They did not need to. They had already condemned her. The trial was a formality, a piece of theater to legitimize a foregone conclusion. She stood before them, wrists bound, and said nothing. Her silence was her only shield. To plead, to deny, would be to give their accusations weight. She would not give them the satisfaction. All she could think of was Cassian. Where was he? Did he know? Had Valerius moved so quickly that the king had been caught unaware? Or worse, had he sanctioned this? Had their alliance been a lie, a means for him to use her to expose his enemy before cutting her loose? The thought was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. The council pronounced her guilty. The sentence was death by fire, to be carried out at sunrise. A witch's death for a witch's crime. As they led her away, she finally allowed herself to search the faces in the room, looking for any sign of the king. He was not there. They locked her in a holding cell in the dungeons. It was small, damp, and smelled of despair. There was no window, only a small barred grate in the heavy wooden door. She was alone with the chilling certainty of her impending death. She did not weep. The part of her that could feel such things had been cauterized long ago. Instead, she thought of Cassian's face in the firelight of his study. "Then you will stand with me when the storm breaks." Had he lied? Or had the storm simply been too powerful, sweeping him away with her? Hours passed. The torchlight in the corridor outside her cell dimmed. The sounds of the castle faded into the deep silence of the night. She sat on the cold stone floor, her back against the wall, and waited for the dawn. The distant sound of a single set of footsteps, steady and unhurried. They were coming for her. Her time was up. She closed her eyes, preparing herself. The footsteps stopped outside her cell. There was the sound of a key in the lock, the groan of the heavy mechanism turning. The door swung inward. It was not the executioner. It was King Cassian. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, the torchlight from the hall behind him casting his face in shadow. He held a long, thin blade in one hand. He stepped into the cell, closing the door behind him. He did not speak. He knelt before her and, with a single, precise cut, severed the ropes binding her wrists. The blade was so sharp she barely felt it. She rubbed her chafed skin, her eyes never leaving his face. She could not read his expression in the dark. "Valerius has overplayed his hand," he said, his voice a low whisper. "He forced the council's vote while I was inspecting the western garrison. A convenient emergency he arranged himself." He had not abandoned her. He had been tricked. The relief was so sharp, so sudden, it was like a physical blow. "They mean to burn me at dawn," she said, her voice hoarse. "I know." He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. His grip on her arm was like iron. "The council has sealed your warrant. To defy it openly would be to declare war on my own lords. It would fracture the kingdom." "So, you will let them kill me?" The question was bitter. "No," he said, his face close to hers in the darkness. She could feel his breath on her skin. "I will give them a choice." He pulled her from the cell, his blade held ready. The corridor was empty. He had come alone. He led her not up toward the castle, but deeper into the dungeons, through a series of winding, forgotten passageways. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of wet earth and old stone. Finally, they came to a small circular chamber. In the center of the room was a stone table. Lord Valerius was tied to it. He was gagged, his eyes wide with terror. Standing over him were the two royal guards who had flanked Cassian on the first day. They bowed their heads as the king entered. Cassian pushed Alara forward until she was standing at the foot of the table, looking down at the man who had condemned her. "The council wants a confession for the poisonings," Cassian said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "Valerius will provide one. He will confess that he forced you to create the poison, that you were his unwilling accomplice, and that he framed you when you threatened to expose him." He held out a small, wicked-looking knife to her, its handle wrapped in leather. "He will require some persuasion. His confession will save your life. You will be pardoned as a victim of his coercion. The council will have its scapegoat. I will have my advisor's treason exposed, and the kingdom will remain stable." Alara stared at the knife, then at Valerius's terrified face. This was the choice. Not a trial, not a battle, a quiet, brutal act in the bowels of the earth. He was offering her revenge. He was offering her a way to save herself, paid for with another man's blood. She looked at Cassian, at his cold, gray eyes. He was testing her. He wanted to see what she was capable of. Was she a killer like him? Could she be as ruthless as the world required? She thought of the men who had died. She thought of Jorik, fighting for every breath. She thought of the pyre they were building for her in the bailey. She reached out and took the knife. Its weight was solid and real in her hand. She walked to Valerius's side. He struggled against his bonds, a muffled cry coming from behind the gag. She raised the knife. Cassian watched her, his face unreadable. Then, she turned the knife around, offering it back to him, hilt first. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady in the silence of the room. "I am a healer. I do not break things. I mend them." A long, taut silence descended. Cassian stared at the knife, then at her face. Something shifted in his eyes, a profound, tectonic movement in the depths of his soul. It was not anger. It was not disappointment. It was something that looked almost like recognition, as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. He had offered her a path of darkness, the path he himself had walked his entire life. And she had refused. She had chosen to remain what she was. He took the knife from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. the faint whisper of skin on leather. Then he turned to his guards. "Take him to the council," he commanded. "Tell them he confessed freely. Tell them the healer's testimony will corroborate everything. And tell them that if they do not accept his confession and grant her a full and immediate pardon, I will dissolve the council and hang every last one of them for treason myself. Let them choose." The guards untied Valerius and dragged him, stumbling and weeping, from the room. Ilara and Cassian were left alone in the silence. "You have made a powerful enemy of the council," she said quietly. "I have had powerful enemies since the day I was born," he replied. "They are nothing new." He had not looked at her. He was staring at the empty stone table. "Why?" he asked, his voice so low she almost didn't hear him. "Why refuse?" "Because that is your world," she said. "Not mine, and I will not let you drag me into it." He finally turned to look at her. The emptiness in his eyes was still there, but it no longer looked like a void. It looked like a space that was waiting to be filled. "What if it is too late?" he whispered. She did not have an answer for him. She only knew that in a cold, dark room, deep beneath a castle of stone, a king had offered her a blade, and she had offered him a choice of his own. And the world had not ended. It had simply held its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. The pyre built for her was dismantled before the sun was fully risen. Lord Valerius's confession, extracted by means unknown and delivered to a terrified council by the king's personal guard, was absolute. He had named himself the sole architect of the poisonings, painting Ilara as his unwilling pawn, coerced under threat. The council, faced with the king's explicit and brutal ultimatum, had no choice but to accept it. They issued a formal pardon, and by mid-morning, Ilara was no longer a condemned traitor. She was a state-sanctioned victim, a heroine. The transition was nauseating. She returned to her chamber in the eastern spire and bolted the door. She did not want to see the pitying, fearful looks from the soldiers. She did not want to accept the council's hollow apologies. She wanted only silence. She had been saved, but she felt no relief. She had been pulled back from the edge of one abyss, only to find herself standing at the edge of another, far deeper one. The space between herself and the king had been irrevocably altered. They were no longer king and subject, captor and captive. They were two people who had seen the worst parts of each other in a dungeon and had not looked away. She spent the day in her room, her hands finally idle. She found she could not rest. She kept seeing Valerius's terrified eyes, the cold gleam of the knife in Cassian's hand. She had refused to become a torturer, but she was complicit in what had been done. Her freedom had been bought with his brutality. The thought settled like a stone in her gut. That evening, as dusk bled across the wasted plains, there was a quiet knock on her door. It was not the knock of a guard or a servant. It was hesitant, uncertain. She did not answer. The knock came again, softer this time. She walked to the door and listened. She could hear the faint sound of breathing on the other side. She slid the bolt back and opened the door a few inches. Cassian stood there. He was dressed, as he had been the first time he came to her room, in a simple woolen tunic. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she had ever seen them. He was holding something. It was a small wooden box. "For you," he said, his voice low. He held it out. She took it. The wood was smooth and dark, polished by age. It was warm from his hands. She looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. "An apology is a tool of politicians," he said, as if sensing her thought. "This is a payment for a debt." She opened the box. Inside, Nestled on a bed of faded velvet was a set of healer's tools. They were exquisite. The needles were silver, the probes carved from ivory, the small, sharp scalpels forged from a dark, gleaming steel she did not recognize. They were the tools of a master, ancient and perfectly preserved. "They belonged to my mother," he said, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "She was a healer before she was a queen." This, she realized, was the most profound revelation he had ever offered. A piece of his past, given freely, a secret from the heart of his solitude. He was not just the empty king. He was the son of a healer. He understood in some fundamental way what it was she did, why she had made the choice she had in the dungeon. She looked from the tools back to his face. She saw the boy he must have been, watching his mother mend the broken things of the world. She saw the man he had become, forced to break them instead. "Why are you giving them to me?" she whispered. "Because you are the first person I have met in a very long time," he said, his gray eyes finally meeting hers. "Who knows the difference between curing a wound and causing one?" The silence that fell between them was no longer fraught with tension or danger. It was something else entirely. It was a space of shared understanding, a quiet field where two exhausted soldiers had laid down their arms. He made no move to enter her room, and she made no move to close the door. They simply stood there, in the deepening twilight, separated by a threshold that no longer seemed to matter. She thought of Yorick. With Valerius's confession had come the formula for the poison, and with it, the key to the antidote. She had spent the afternoon brewing it. Yorick would live. The other afflicted men would live. She had done her work. She was free to go. The thought of leaving, which had once been her only desire, now felt like a betrayal. Leaving him would be like leaving a part of herself behind. "I have found an antidote," she said, changing the subject. "The men will recover." "I know," he said. "Your work is done here. You can leave whenever you wish. The gates will be opened for you." He was offering her back the freedom he had taken, the freedom she had craved. She looked down at the box in her hands, at the tools that had belonged to his mother. A gift, a payment, an anchor. To accept it was to accept a bond she could not name. To refuse it was to sever it forever. She closed the lid of the box, the soft click of wood on wood. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked, her voice steady. The question hung in the air between them, terrifying and fragile. For the first time since she had met him, Cassian looked uncertain. The vast, cold emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something raw and vulnerable. It was hope, a terrible, dangerous hope. He did not answer with words. He simply reached out and gently took the wooden box from her hands, setting it down on the small table inside her room. He did not release her hand. His fingers curled around hers, his calloused palm rough against her skin. His hand was cold, as always, but for the first time, she did not flinch from its touch. He was not saving her. She was not saving him. They were simply two people standing in a doorway at the edge of the world who had finally been witnessed. And in the profound, earned silence that followed, that was more than enough. It was everything.